I think it's good to be careful about what we say. We make claims about people. So this is for educational purposes. Uh, you know, people make mistakes. It's all right. Just correct them.
By faith. Some of the solas we would say would be hills to die on. Sola Scriptura, of course, which would negate, unfortunately, Ellen White and her book, right?
It's so funny, man. They like, and again,
Are Adventists not sola scriptura? Do we make Ellen White part of the Bible? Well, we'll find out. What is sola scriptura really?
and this is a lot of the Adventist efforts to try and blend in with Protestantism. So if you go to their website, they use the phrase sola scriptura. That's the only sola they use. And the problem is, though, it's just like with everything else, they give it its own definition. It's closer to like the Socinian idea. I don't know if you're familiar with like the Socinian heresy from around the time of the Reformation, 1600s. They had this concept that the Adventists have called Bible only. So they don't understand that sola scriptura was in response to Rome that was saying capital T tradition and scripture is subservient to that. And the reformers were saying, no, it's the other way around. Scripture is.
Is this accurate now? Let's find out.
Bible, the scripture itself, is a uniquely normative rule of faith and practice. Now, that can be unpacked into kind of three claims, but that's the basic idea. And these are the three claims in a nutshell. Number one, scripture is the unequaled, uniquely normative source of divine revelation, which is divinely commissioned to function as the rule of faith and practice. Number two, scripture is the fully trustworthy and uniquely sufficient rule of faith and practice. And number three, scripture is the final norm of faith and practice that norms all others. So in those three ways, scripture stands alone. It's unique in those three ways. And sola scriptura means that by scripture, everything else is to be judged when it comes to faith and practice. Now, there's three kinds of corollaries or things that go along with sola scriptura. Three other principles. The first is tota scriptura, which means that all of scripture is to function as this rule, not just parts, not just individual selections, but the entirety of the Bible, which we refer to as the biblical canon. We'll talk about a little bit later. So tota scriptura. The next principle goes right along with that. It's called the analogy of scripture. And the analogy of scripture simply means that you understand scripture by comparing parts of scripture with other parts of scripture. Or put differently, you understand parts of scripture by reading them in light of the rest of scripture, right? So the tota scriptura and the analogy of scripture, they go together, kind of like a hand in a glove. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is the principle that spiritual things are spiritually discerned. So this is the principle of sola scriptura and corollaries that follow from it. Nevertheless, as I mentioned before, there's quite a bit of confusion about sola scriptura. So it's very important for us also to recognize four things that sola scriptura does not mean, to avoid misunderstandings, which is what causes problems when we start talking about prophets outside of scripture that we'll talk about a little bit later in this program. So the first thing that sola scriptura does not teach, it does not teach that scripture is the only source of knowledge. The Bible itself tells us that there is knowledge outside of scripture and even outside of prophetic revelation. In fact, there's even other kinds of revelation. God has revealed himself in nature in a lesser way, in a way that isn't as clear, isn't always as discernible, and thus doesn't hold anything like the same kind of authority of scripture. But there's revelation even outside of scripture, which theologians sometimes call general revelation. And the Bible itself recognizes this. So if you think sola scriptura means that scripture is the only source of knowledge, well, then you're already contradicting the very scripture that you're reading, right? Or if you think it's even the only revelation, there can't be any other revelation outside of scripture, that already comes into conflict with scripture. Secondly, the sola scriptura principle does not affirm that all theological doctrines or church practices require direct biblical statements. In other words, you don't just quote scripture, it's what scripture is teaching, whether or not the words themselves are in scripture, so to speak. And that includes sola scriptura itself. Sola scriptura is a Latin phrase, which means by scripture alone. That phrase is not found in scripture, but the teaching is found in scripture, because the Bible teaches that this divine revelation commissioned by God stands alone as a rule or an authority. The third thing that sola scriptura does not mean is it does not mean or affirm that scripture excludes reason or requires no interpretation, or that one's private interpretation of scripture is the correct understanding of scripture. And finally, the fourth thing that sola scriptura does not mean, it does not mean that interpretive communities and tradition should be dismissed and or ignored. We can learn things from others' reading of scriptures. We can learn things from secondary sources like commentaries. It's just that those things cannot be normative, right? Those things must all be ruled by scripture itself. But we can still learn things from them. We don't just dismiss them or ignore them and read scripture in isolation. So sola scriptura denies both isolationism, where I read the Bible entirely by myself, but it also rules out any kind of creedalism, where there's something outside of scripture that is used as an authority or even a lens through which we read scripture. Ideally, scripture is allowed to rule in the way that God commissioned it to rule. That's the sola scriptura principle in a nutshell.
The Seventh-day Adventist theology comes under a lot of scrutiny.
So if you want to see either of these full videos from Answering Adventism or what I was just playing from the Biblical Institute Research Institute with John C. Peckham from Andrews University. I believe he's the head of theology and philosophy at Andrews. I think. There's more to that too if you're interested, but sometimes nuts got to get cracked.